Hi, my name is Shona Kinsella and I am a fantasy author. I wrote storage fantasy Ashale Rising and dark Scottish fantasy Petra MacDonald and the Queen of the Fae. Some of you might also know me as the editor of BFS Horizons magazine. Today I'm going to read to you a section from The Flame and the Flood, my new novella which comes out with Fox Spirit Books later this year. Tallis bowed her head and sniffed at the sour jura fruit, not ripe. She placed it back in the basket and selected another, adding it to her shopping basket with one pair of hands while paying the trader with the other. She paused for a moment beneath the canopy of the fruit stall, pulling her navy blue hair up into a knot on top of her head, while waiting for a crowd of chattering drones to pass by before stepping out into the thoroughfare. They were boisterous, especially the few winged members of the group, and people moved aside to make way for them. Tallis strolled along in their wake, gaze roaming over the hexagonal marketplace, filled with stalls and people and even a few goats. She had already bought meat and vegetables, enough food to keep the boarding house running for the next few days, but she was enjoying the sun on her skin, and for once the air was fairly clear, the constant smog from the factories lifting away in the fresh breeze. She wandered over to the stall of the spice merchant to see if there was anything new today. The boat from Acros had come in yesterday, bringing spices, fabrics and alcohol for trade, and the market was busy today as a result. Tallis leaned over the spice stall to check the pots at the back, and movement caught the corner of her eye. The edge of the wooden table was sprouting new leaves. She looked up sharply, her antenna quivering. Someone nearby was leaking magic, her affinity for wood overflowing and causing unintended effects. Tallis studied the crowd, seeking out the wielder, searching every face for a clue. Nothing. She stretched her antenna, swivelling them around to seek out the vibrations of the magic that was leaking through the market, making the wood behave strangely. A few stalls along, heading in the direction of the boarding house, bark was growing up one of the sanded table legs. She set off in that direction, gaze fixed on the stalls and carts of wood. The wielder was close, but the number of people here and all of their conflicting vibration and emotions was making it difficult to focus on her. Tallis's antenna curled up, and a sour feeling settled in her stomach. She heard Vinhart a breath later. There was no mistaking the hoarse voice of one of the worst slavers in Quartil. She had suffered damage to her throat in a factory accident that left scars on her neck and on her voice. She was accompanied by the smell of stale beer. Tallis wrinkled her nose up, turning her face towards the nearest stall as the slaver passed. What is Vinhart doing here? This is a mid-level market. This isn't her hunting ground. I thought they were only taking wielders from the outer reaches now. Tallis risked a glance over her shoulder and saw Vinhart lingering a few paces away, looking at the goods on a stall on the other side of the thoroughfare. Then it dawned on her at last. Vinhart wasn't here as a slaver, he was just shopping. The slaver might spend time in the inner circles of the colony, but he wasn't one of them. He was only a mid-level drone, just like Tallis and Almaris. Cowering between the stall that Tallis stood next to and the next was a young person. Silver hair fell around a lilac face with eyes screwed shut. Barely more than a larva as he was shivering despite the mid-morning warmth, her antenna drooping, both sets of arms wrapped around her thorax. Beside her, the wood of the table legs began to bend, causing the stall to sag. Tallis' antenna sprang up again. Here was the source of the leak, the affinity wielder. Tallis glanced over her shoulder at Vinhart, who was moving away at a leisurely pace. Casually as he moved along to stand between the two stalls, shielding the wielder with her body. Her hand brushed against the small axe that was strapped to her belt. For a moment she pictured herself burying the axe in the slaver's skull, but then she shook her head. A moment's fantasy, nothing more. Vinhart laughed at something her companion said, the sound going through Tallis like the factory whistles. She suppressed a shudder and feigned interest in the selection of cheeses on the next stall. "What's this, then?" Vinhart said, the greed in her voice clear. Tallis watched from the corner of her eye as Vinhart started back toward where he stood. The wooden tables on either side of the wielder were reshaping themselves, as if reaching towards the person who had between them. "Go!" Tallis hissed. The wielder opened terrified violet eyes and stared at her. "Quickly, run!" Vinhart was almost upon them before the wielder leapt to her feet and took off. Tallis pretended to be startled by the sudden movement and fell back against the bowed table. The tortured legs finally gave way, spilling the contents directly into Vinhart's path. The slaver swore and glared at Tallis, but was quickly distracted by the sight of the fleeing wielder. "Stop there!" he called. The young person looked over her shoulder, panic stamped on her features. She took a sharp turn into an alley, skidding on refuse as she went. Vinhart kicked pots and dishes out of her way as they followed, her companion lagging behind. "Keeper of lost souls, guide her to safety," Tallis murmured. Then the stall owner was at her side, apologising for the collapse, asking if she was okay. "I am well," Tallis said, listening to the sounds of pursuit down the alley. "Let me help you." As quickly as they could, they stacked clay pots beside the broken table, picking up cheeses that were wrapped in wax paper and placing them on top of the pots. "What do you think that was all about?" the trader asked as they worked together to clear the mess. "A thief, perhaps?" Tallis looked up sharply. Could it really be that the trader didn't realise what had happened right in front of her? That a wielder was about to be caught and pressed into slavery? She sighed and shook her head. Sometimes it was hard for Tallis to remember that the issue which dominated her whole life was barely considered by others. "I suppose it must have been something like that," she said, standing up and dusting off her clothing. "May you have a prosperous day." As Tallis hurried away, the trader was already turning to the next stall and striking up a conversation. No doubt the market would buzz all day with talk of the thief who had been chased off. The wielder and her pursuers had been heading east towards the docks, so Tallis headed in that direction through the marketplace and out into the streets beyond, peering into alleys whenever she could. There was no sign of the wielder or Vinhart. By the time the factory whistles blew midday, Tallis had not located them. Reluctantly, as they turned for home, the pleasant morning marred by the encounter. The sun no longer felt so good. Instead, guilt and helplessness conspired to make her edgy. If only they had been able to do more to help the young person. If only they had come across the wielder sooner, before Vinhart had appeared in the market. Tallis looked up from her thoughts, startled when someone touched her elbow. Batanel had appeared at her side. If Tallis had not been so absorbed in her thoughts, she would have picked up on Batanel's familiar vibrations before her friends had been close enough to touch her. "Almaris sent me out looking for you," Batanel said. "There's been a bit of excitement around the boarding house." "What's happened?" Tallis asked, alarm making her heart beat faster, a syncopated rhythm that thrummed in her thorax. "Is he all right?" "Almaris is fine. Vinhart was searching the alleys around the house, shouting about a wood wielder." Tallis frowned. Was it just a coincidence that the conflict he had seen in the market had continued around the boarding house? "What is Almaris doing now?" she asked, picking up her pace. "We waited until Vinhart had gone, and then Almaris went out to search the alleys in case the wielder Vinhart was looking for is hiding nearby. She asked me to come and find you and bring you home in case the wielder is hurt." "Soot and ashes," Tallis muttered. "What's wrong?" Batanel asked. "I saw a wood wielder in the market, looking all over the place," Tallis said, picking up the pace. "Vinhart spotted her before I could do anything to get her away. They took off down an alley and I tried to follow in parallel streets, but I lost them." "Do you think it's the same wielder?" "That seems likely. I don't like Vinhart being so close to the boarding house." They hurried through the streets side by side, skirting around large drones who watched them go. As they passed the textile factory, a stream of smaller workers in patched and ragged clothes made their way inside. Tallis grimaced at the cruel irony, her anger at the greed of the factory owners never far away. He rounded the corner at the end of the factory and almost walked straight into a large crick pulling a carriage. Battenale jumped back, pulling Tallis with her. The carriage driver cursed at them, cracking the whip next to the crick's ear, driving it on. A curtain covered the window in the carriage door, and it twitched as it drew level with them, revealing a hand that glittered with jewellery before the curtain fell back again and the carriage continued on its way. Tallis leaned against a soot-stained wall, waiting for her heart to slow. Battenale's green skin had paled, and he was breathing fast. "I hate the overseers," Battenale grunted. "They act as if the streets belonged to them as well as the factories." "Let's go," Tallis said, squeezing Battenale's arm. "Almaris!" Tallis called as soon as he was through the boarding house door. "Are you here?" The hexagonal hallway stretched before her, dust motes dancing in a beam of light. The water clock gurgled, and Tallis realised that she was leaking a little herself, the stress of the morning wearing down her control. She was glad that none of the boarders were home at this time of day. "In the kitchen!" Almaris called, sounding cheerful. Breathing a sigh of relief, Tallis strode to the back of the building, Battenale close at her back. The scent of the morning's meal lingered in the air, and Tallis noted a dirty mark on the floor as he passed. "Is everything all right?" she asked, walking into the kitchen. As soon as he entered the rooms, he stopped in her tracks. Sitting at the kitchen table was the wielder from earlier. Her silver hair was dishevelled, tunic and leggings covered in dirt. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of hot broth, the steam tugging at Tallis's attention. Thankfully, the wielder's affinity was no longer leaking. Tallis's table was unaffected. The wielder's jaw dropped. You were at the market!" She got to her feet and backed away from the table. Tallis slowly placed her shopping basket on the table and held all four hands up, palms towards the young person, and Battenale did the same at her side. Her antennae were quivering in sympathy to the young wielder's fear. "Don't be alarmed," Tallis said. "We're not going to hurt you." "Why should I believe you?" the wielder asked, back pressed against the wall, eyes wide and frightened. Her antennae stood rigid, and Tallis felt her own spring up in response. Tallis looked towards the deep sink at the other end of the room and waited until she knew the wielder was looking too. Then she stretched out a hand and made a beckoning gesture. A stream of water rose into the air above the sink, forming a ball which floated towards Tallis. She moved her fingers as if plucking the strings of a harp, and the water began to dance, splitting and flowing into sinuous shapes. The wielder watched, eyes shining. Tallis directed the water into a cup that sat on the table. "What's your name?" "Dookie," the wielder said. Then in a quieter voice, "You already know I have an affinity for wood." Almaris stepped towards Dookie. "You can relax. You're safe here." She gestured to the seat that Dookie had recently vacated. "Please, finish your broth." "How did you get away from Vinhart?" Tallis asked as Dookie slid into the seat again. Tallis was still suspicious, but the predominant feeling that came from the wielder was fear, so she was willing to hear her out. Dookie met Tallis's gaze as he spoke and gave no signs of deception. "I came out beside the textile factory. There was a carriage stopped outside. The driver was dozing on top, so I slid underneath and hid. I heard them coming out of the alley and I curled up as tight as I could. The slaver was so angry it made my antenna shrink. He was shouting, and the carriage driver woke up. He didn't want to admit to being asleep, so he swore I hadn't come that way." "How did you come to be here?" Tallis asked, looking at her spouse. "I stayed under the carriage until I couldn't hear them anymore. I was so scared I wanted to just stay there all day, but my affinity was leaking a little. The wood floor of the carriage started to look like it had been carved, and I worried the driver would notice something, so I crept out and ran. I took the first alley that I came to, and I was sneaking along when Almaris found me. She said I could hide here until I was safe." Dookie looked back and forward between Almaris and Tallis, clearly reluctant to get her saviour into trouble. I heard Vinhart shouting and searching in the street, Almaris said. As soon as Z and her companion moved on, I went looking for Juki here. I could feel her affinity as soon as I turned into the alleys he was in. It was just luck that Vinhart didn't stumble over here. Very well, Tallis said, sitting down with a sigh. It all sounded reasonable. Perhaps it really was just a coincidence that the conflict he had seen started at the market should end so close to her home. Batanel, would you take Juki upstairs? The attic room is empty. Of course, Batanel answered from her place by the door. Juki, there's a wardrobe full of clothes. I'm sure you'll be able to find something that fits. I'll warm some water so that you can wash up. Almaris and I have work to do this afternoon. I'll bring up a meal to you later, and we can decide what to do next. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you're all staying safe out there. Bye!